This is the third audio file for part 2 of the week 5 lecture. Going on to slide 16. A Cabinet Planning Board study in 1939 pointed to the difficulties in continuing the war in China unless there were assured supplies of strategic commodities like oil, tin, and rubber. In this period, the United States and the British were not interested in supplying these commodities to the Japanese so that they could continue their war in China, both for humanitarian reasons. In foreign policy, these would be referred to as human rights reasons nowadays, and also for reasons of strategic advantage, because the increasingly aggressive Japanese posture in China that led to war between China and Japan threatened British and U.S. interests. And so there was an oil embargo underway, led by the United States, which confirmed the ideas of many Japanese thinkers that war between the United States and Japan was inevitable. The immediate goal, however, was to secure the resources of Southeast Asia. And so the Japanese knew, however, that in order to do that, they had to put the Americans out of commission to defang them, and the principal U.S. threat was on the water. The U.S. Navy was a major naval power at this time, nothing compared to what the U.S. Navy is today, but it was a force to be reckoned with, and the Japanese hoped to catch them all in Pearl Harbor, which, if you take a look at a map of Oahu and you take a look at Pearl Harbor, you can see that it's a marvelous port, but it's a box. Nothing gets out in a hurry from Pearl Harbor, and the U.S. Navy had put a lot of ships there. The Japanese thought that they were going to catch most of the Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor, but they didn't. So it was a gamble on their part. It paid off to an extent, but it was not the mortal blow that they hoped to land. So there were negotiations between the two sides, but they broke off with the Japanese deciding to again use the surprise attack tactic, which for the short term worked very well. Let's go on to slide 17. So at the same time as the attack against Hawaii on December 7th, 1941, the international date lying between Hawaii and the rest of Asia, as it does, it was December 8th in East Asia, and that was the day when the Japanese began their attacks in Southeast Asia. The landings in Malaya, the use of troops on bicycles, very interestingly, to travel quickly down the Malay Peninsula. The thing to keep in mind here is that there were not British troops everywhere in Malaya. They had focused their forces on places they considered important, which were these straits settlements, Penang, Malacca, and Singapore. Singapore was the big fortress, and the reason it was there is because it was not only a good place to trade, but it was also very strategic. Singapore controlled the Straits of Johor. which was a major transit point between Europe and East Asia. And it still is, of course, very important today. So the Japanese did not attack it, just like in the Port Arthur attack. The Japanese did not focus their main attack from the ocean, which would have run up against British guns that were designed to destroy such an attack, but they approached Singapore from the rear. And there's a video that you can see that it's old, and it's old-fashioned as well, but it's got a lot of good information in it about the nature of those times, and it gives you some perspective from both sides. So the Japanese expanded quickly because nobody was ready for them. There's an interesting similarity between the attitudes of Chiang Kai-shek and Franklin Delano Roosevelt at the time. Roosevelt faced a different problem with his population. His population was not clamoring for war. His population was clamoring for non-involvement for the most part. There were a few people who wanted more support to China, more support to Britain, certainly. But on Roosevelt's political plate, there were mostly people who were isolationist, as they're now called. And so he was unable to enter war against Japan and against Germany, even if he wanted to, before December 7th, 1941. After that, of course, the attitudes changed. There was popular outrage, and people were anxious to join up, and so the United States was able to enter the war. But it was unprepared, relatively speaking. There had been some military buildup, but Roosevelt had instituted the draft, but it was it all came sooner than perhaps he might have wished. So when the Americans entered the war, fortunately most of their fleet was not in Pearl Harbor at the time of the Japanese attack, and so there was immediately this Battle of Midway that set the tone for the rest of the war, where U.S. power, when it was focused on a Japanese target, was generally successful, especially at sea. But it was a long haul. Japan's naval and air power was destroyed, but it took until 1943 for most of that job to be done. In other words, it took about 18 months of very fierce fighting. And along with that part of the war, there was also the assaults on land. At this point, the Japanese were threatening Australia, and that was the first focus, was to make sure that that threat was countered. And the land battles that occurred between the Americans and the Japanese were so costly on both sides that the Americans decided to engage in an island hopping campaign where they left some Japanese garrisons to rot, basically, to starve, while they went on to other island chains that were more important strategically. And typically they picked targets that were important because they had key Japanese forces on them that could be used to attack Allied forces. Let's go on now to slide 18, and this, I think, goes directly into the basic problem that the Japanese faced, which was that they were, to be blunt, full of themselves. The myth of racial superiority and the idea that with Bushido, the military way, the way of the warrior, that one could overcome any obstacle simply by trying really, really hard, was just a bunch of baloney when you got right down to it. They were highly successful when they could focus their forces, but they weren't supermen. And all the ideas of behind racial superiority, those illusions, and the Bushido myth were focused and caused them to believe that they could accomplish anything simply because they were Japanese. And that was their downfall in the end. It took a long time, but that was their downfall. As I mentioned before, when they would occupy these vast stretches of the Pacific, including China, they were not able to really engage in the same sort of occupation as the Germans did in Europe. Their forces were stretched thin along key logistical lines, such as railways and in cities, and that's all they could do. So that's why guerrilla warfare against them was so successful. And this is why the Americans were able to slowly defeat them in an incredibly costly drone of war that went on for the first 2 years of the conflict. It continued, of course, past that, but now the control faction was in trouble, and Tojo Hideki, their leader, was forced to resign as prime minister in January of 1944. Going on to slide 19, leading up to the surrender of Japan, there were events that were ghastly. The incredibly costly firebombing of Tokyo in March of 1945 was followed by the lower casualties of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the atomic attacks, but which were, of course, instantaneous, in spite of being only about half the quantity of the people lost in Tokyo. And this is what convinced the Japanese that the jig was up. There were still people who wanted to fight to the very end, who wanted to engage the entire Japanese home island populace in defense against the Americans and go down swinging, resulting in the virtual extinction of the Japanese people. This is what people were actually thinking amongst those extremists who, after the emperor had recorded his speech instructing the armed forces to surrender before it was broadcast, they tried to kidnap him, to make him, to force him to record another speech that would say quite the opposite. But that didn't work out. There were people died, but they were overcome, and the emperor's surrender announcement was broadcast on 16 August 1945, followed by the former surrender aboard the USS Missouri on 2 September. So going on to slide 20, the Allies did not expect this. The Chinese Communists and the Chinese Nationalists did not expect this. Everybody thought that the Japanese would continue to resist and that an invasion of Japan was going to be necessary even after the atomic bomb was dropped. Of course, the idea of the atomic bomb was that it would stop this from having to occur, and indeed it did. But people were not prepared on the Allied side to receive the Japanese surrender, and so there was a scramble in China to take the surrender of Japanese troops. This resulted in the farcical order by Chiang Kai-shek to the communists to stand down and not accept surrender. Of course, the communists just laughed at that and proceeded to accept surrender and take as much territory as they could, along with the arms that the Japanese had. Go on to slide 21. The Americans were not interested in seeing a civil war in China because what they wanted was post-war recovery. And so the Marshall Mission was conceived and implemented. Unfortunately for the cause of peace and for the hundreds of thousands of people who were displaced and died in the period that followed, only the Americans took this idea of a coalition government and a peaceful resolution of the Chinese Civil War very seriously. To make a long story short, both sides just used the Marshall Mission and the negotiations in Beijing, Peking, to buy time. Going on to slide 22. So when the Marshall Mission failed, the Civil War commenced. The Kuomintang, the KMT, initially had gains all over China, and they tried, like the Japanese before them, they tried to do too much. They could not quite make it. They tried to occupy entire stretches of land, starting in the cities, and the communists took very much the opposite approach. They retreated where the nationalists were strong, and surrounded the cities with their forces and waited until the opportunities presented themselves. And they were only losing the Civil War for about 6 months to a year after this. Then they began to consolidate their position and move on nationalist forces and pick them off one by one. The Kuomintang began to lose a lot of supplies. Even in 1947, they were losing almost half the supplies that were given to them by the Americans, and the communists would take them over. And as time went on, people at the level of ordinary person all the way up to senior government officials began to realize which way the wind was blowing. And so the Communist intelligence services became very successful in recruiting agents and in gathering information. And indeed, even the nationalist attack against Yan'an, which resulted in the communists fleeing, was an intelligence success, because the communists knew about 2 weeks beforehand that the nationalists were coming, and they just picked up and left. Let's go on to slide 23. So as the Civil War concluded, it concluded with one city after another falling, beginning in late 1948 up in Mukden, or present-day Shenyang, all the way down to Guangzhou at the end of the year. It took a while after October 1st, 1949, the founding date of the People's Republic, for all of the nationalist forces to be rounded up, mopped up, as they say, but it was pretty inevitable at this point. And so, going on to slide 24, Mao had decided that the Americans were not in any way trustworthy or reliable because of their long association with the Kuomintang, and so he decided to lean to one side, as he put it in a famous speech of that time. There was this incident with the U.S. consulate staff in Shenyang, or Mukden, which at the time, in that context, was similar to the the loss of the U.S. embassy in Tehran in 1979. And it destroyed any potential of good relations between the U.S. and China. And Moscow became the center of attention for the Chinese communists, and a friendship period was initiated. Let's go on to slide 25. And so China's long period of isolation began at this point. They weren't isolated from the Soviets. Mao Zedong's position as leader of the Communist Party now was unassailable. He had taken a movement which was in extreme danger and didn't look like it was ever going to succeed, and he turned it into the government of a new China. His personality cult only grew from this point and reached the levels of ridiculousness by the 1960s, and policy went back and forth between peaceful coexistence and militancy, and between being an ally of the Soviet Union to being an enemy of both the United States and the Soviet Union. But there's an interesting continuity as a legacy of that time, that China is not a status quo power. They are an anti-status quo power even today. And this is one reason why the United States and China remain far apart in many of their goals. The Chinese want the things that I've listed here, and they wanted them back in 1949 and 1950, a resumption of their previous place in the world and restoration of full sovereignty over territory being the most important. Well, next week we will talk about how World War II transformed the rest of Asia, which will lead us into the post-war period and the Cold War itself. Have a good weekend.